depending on your metrics, the Irish DPC is the fourth or fifth biggest supervisory authority, whether that's on its budget or on a number of people. And the reason for that is because we have the platforms based in Ireland that it becomes the lead supervisory authority for. Since GDPR has come into force, we've had, I think, in terms of the number of cross-border complaints that have been referred, 87% of those have been from other areas in Europe to the Irish DPC. So it is a key player from a European perspective. And that's why it's useful to look at its decisions and how it goes about them. In terms of, we had very recently in the last week or so the annual report from the DPC, and that has kind of some insights in terms of the kind of work that it's undertaking and in terms of the kind of the scope of its work and how much it's doing. You see there large number of contacts. Maybe some of the key things from here you might look at is that in terms of the cases it receives, it's now roughly on an even keel. It's resolving roughly the same number of cases it receives as come in. I think it's fair to say there's still a backlog there they're working through. They haven't always been able to get to that. So there's still a backlog to work through. They're not getting through the backlog, but they're not getting any worse in terms of their kind of closing of cases. One of the other points to look at there is the valid breach notifications. So 81% of the 7,781 have been concluded within a year. I think some data controllers might be pleased to hear that because the Irish DPC changed its authority, changed its approach a few years ago, where it doesn't issue a controller with a confirmation that their case has been concluded when there's a data breach. So if you're dealing with the IDPC and you've reported a data breach, you can't expect to receive any kind of positive confirmation. That's fine now. We're closing our file. They just go quiet and you just have to carry on your way. So it's interesting there have been a large number have been completed and concluded, but the data controllers may or may not know that that's the case. Then in terms of maybe its overall output over the last year, in 2024, there were 4 large-scale inquiries concluded. When we say large-scale, in Ireland, that means platform-related inquiries. Then there are a number of other inquiries were concluded. But actually, when you look at the cadence, it's very low numbers. But if you look at trends over the last few years, when Dale Sunderland and then Des Hogan were appointed, there was an uptick in the number of statutory inquiries that the DPC was getting through. And last year, there was a little bit of a lull. I think because of the number we're talking about here, we're talking differences of 1 or 2, or 2 or 3 when we're talking about low numbers. Maybe you can't say there's a trend there quite yet. But there's certainly, you would say, they haven't increased their cadence over the last year. So it'll be interesting to see where we get to over 2025. In the report, it talks about 7 draft decisions and 4 preliminary draft decisions being in place. And then we've seen recently there's been some decisions being published. But I think overall, you look at the DPC, and it has been criticised for the volume of work it gets through. I think on one hand, that is potentially valid. The other hand is it does have a lot of work to get through. And we'll see when we talk about the type of enforcement we look at, over the last year, so I took 12 months as my recent decisions, we'll see that DPC enforcement that has ended up in inquiries, we've got 4 which relate to multinationals or platforms, and then we have 3 relating to domestic organisations. And I think when the DPC would probably have some right to take issue with me to talk about DPC enforcement purely in the light of inquiries that end up in fines. The DPC would say it has a huge amount of interactions with data controllers and data processors through its other supervisory activities. And just because there's not an inquiry or a fine doesn't mean there's not lots of enforcement action taking place. But it is the thing that takes the headlines. And you'll see what I propose to you today is talk through some of the key takeaways from these enforcement decisions. Because of the nature of the way the enforcement decisions roll out, I'm not going to focus on the fines and how those fines have been calculated. I'm more going to look at are there things that we can take away from the decisions which are relevant to us as practitioners when we're looking at some of the same issues that arise in those decisions.